Okay, so can you guys, those here, you can hear me? Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you, Jason. And again, I want to extend a welcome to our 6th annual City Tech Science Fiction Symposium and this first panel of the day, which is on access to international SF. And welcome to those of you who are here in the webinar with us, who may be joining via the YouTube live stream, or perhaps who are watching later in the future on the recording. So welcome all. I am Jill Belli. I'm an associate professor of English here at City Tech and one of the co-organizers of this symposium. And this is our second year holding a fully online symposium. And as Jason said, there are challenges with that. And of course, we're all missing sort of the loss of embodied gathering and the community that brings. But one of the perhaps small silver linings of this switch to Zoom is that we're able to bring in scholars who, because of their places on the globe, might not have otherwise been able to join us for this event here in downtown Brooklyn. And this panel showcases 3 of these scholars and thinkers and writers who are going to offer a more global analysis of SF. And I'm really honored to be moderating this discussion and have you all here today. A few just additional housekeeping notes before we get started. The speakers will present for about 10 minutes each. I will keep time in the order they are listed in the program. I'll briefly introduce each speaker, but please note that full bios are available in the program online if you'd like to learn more. And at the end, we will have plenty of time for discussion as a group. As Jason mentioned, please do make use of the Zoom Q&A feature to offer questions and comments. You're welcome to leave those questions at any point throughout the session, but please note that we won't be taking questions until all of our speakers have finished with their presentations. Finally, you're welcome to use the chat feature throughout to interact with the panelists or other attendees. A reminder that our conference hashtag is CityTechSF, and I will let our panelists and myself drop Twitter handles or anything else they want in the chat if they would like other folks to be able to point to them. So that all said, why don't we get started with our first presenter, who is Emrah Atasoy, who I have the pleasure of knowing through my work in utopian studies. And he is a Turkish scholar who studies and writes broadly on utopias and dystopias and science fiction. And today he's going to be speaking to us on access to SF in Turkey and Turkish SF abroad. So whenever you're ready, Emrah.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Jill. Yes, let me get ready. Yes. So I'd like to start first by thanking the organizers of the conference, of course, and for giving me this opportunity to present my current project into Turkish speculative fiction and science fiction. You know, I'm now doing postdoctoral research at the University of Oxford for a year and conducting relevant research. So to start my talk today, the title of my talk is Access to SF in Turkey and Turkish SF Abroad. So Turkey has experienced an increased intellectual and scholarly interest in science fiction and speculative fiction, as well as utopia and dystopia. In this process, access to these literary interdisciplinary traditions has played an influential role in the promotion and development of the genre. Even though there has arisen a greater interest, which has substantially contributed to the reception of the field in Turkey, there are still barriers to access to science fiction. These obstacles generally stem from a lack of sufficient translations of relevant primary and secondary sources, or the fact that science fiction may not be taken seriously enough due to its imaginary and/or fantastical elements. This presentation in this respect aims to offer an insight into access to SF in Turkey and how or if Turkish SF is received and perceived internationally with potential obstacles involved. Additionally, issues such as access to SF for an audience, access to SF as a scholar, and barriers to access to SF for an audience will be addressed with reference to relevant events organized in Turkey and certain representative speculative texts from Turkish literature. It is true that interest in science fiction has increased substantially with the emergence of the pandemic, which we see through the radical rise in the number of relevant books, magazines, workshops, lectures, conferences, especially in relation to pandemic fiction, and or TV series produced in Turkey. Even though such an increase in general is good for the promotion of the genre, both on general public and academic levels, there are still barriers in terms of access to SF for an audience and access to SF as a scholar. In terms of access to SF for an audience, the audience may not be presented with truly relevant sources and materials. This may prevent the audience from accessing the pioneering works of science fiction. Because the genre may not be taken seriously enough, it may also lead the audience to underestimate the power or efficient function of science fiction to predict alternative world orders or to warn us against potential prospective threats. Furthermore, there's a difference in terms of access to SF on the part of the audience, depending on the size of the city. Biggest cities like Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, Bursa, or Antalya in Turkey seem to offer more opportunities and events as compared to smaller cities or towns, which is problematic because the genre remains limited to only bigger cities and within a certain bubble. However, the pandemic and Zoom or Zoomification have now made it possible to provide almost everyone with the opportunity to benefit from related virtual events. In this regard, it is now up to the audience to look for the events and Zoom links and listen to such events if they wish in Turkey. In relation to barriers to access to SF as a scholar, I should point out that the existing barriers are in general for those scholars in Turkey who do not have a good command of English and therefore are lacking in international relevant scholarship. Even though the quality of sources on science fiction in Turkey has been increasing, the lack of sufficient translations of especially secondary theoretical sources poses a big obstacle because scholars interested in SF otherwise do not have access to current contemporary scholarship and approaches unless they are translated. Because there does not exist a well-established tradition or terminology, that also causes a problem in the translation of such works because unless the translator does not have a good command of the field, translation may be highly misleading and problematic as well. This problem of translation also prevents Turkish SF from having an international audience unless the authors are translated. We have authors such as Orhan Pamuk, the Nobel laureate, Elif Shafak, Yaşar Kemal, Zülfü Livaneli, or Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar, translated into English or other languages such as German, Russian, or French, but this is still not at a desired level. Today, I seem to be talking about only barriers until now, but now I would like to switch to some positive developments in terms of the promotion of the field in Turkey, which facilitate access to SF for both the audience and scholars. To start with, 16 academics from Turkey have recently edited a collection titled Understanding Science Fiction, Critical Approaches to Subgenres, edited by Dr. Cenk Tan, Dr. Cem Kılıçarslan, and Dr. Seda Uyanık, and published by Nobel Academic Publishing in 2021, in which I also contributed with a chapter. This work is highly important because these academics, mainly from the Western languages and literatures departments, have published it in Turkish using contemporary theoretical sources. The academics have been selected based on the specialization criterion. Although all the academics contributing to this volume already published related materials before. In this collection, there are chapters on the history of SF, science fiction, utopia and dystopia, hard SF, social SF, time travel, apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic fiction, alternate history, soap opera, the new wave, cyberpunk, climate fiction, posthumanism and transhumanism, and Turkish SF. Even though the focus is not on Turkish science fiction, this volume will contribute to the promotion of the genre in Turkey further. Furthermore, there's an international dystopia film festival to be held between December 10th and 12th, actually this coming weekend in Istanbul. This festival, organized for the first time and sponsored by the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism, as well as Üsküdar Municipality in Istanbul, is especially significant, not only because of its extremely multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary nature, but also because it is supported by the ministry for the first time. In this festival, in addition to dystopian film contest, there will be sections on dystopia with the sessions entitled Dystopia, Critical Frameworks and Theoretical Debates, and Artificial Intelligence with the session entitled Artificial Intelligence and New Technological Developments. In these sessions, both Turkish and international academics such as Tom Moylan, Rafaela Baccolin, and Gregor Claes will give talks on different aspects of the fields. In addition to these recent developments, I would like to very briefly mention other related works and projects. Turkish writers in the late Ottoman era and early Republican period placed a significant emphasis upon technology and science as a prerequisite for the development of the society. Through their discussion of such issues, I quote, such as the use of natural and industrial resources and technological methods, religion, politics, ethics, national identity, achieving science and technology, unquote, in speculative works such as Ahmet Hamdi Efendi's A Scientific Novel of American Doctors, published in 1888. A Dream Life by Hüseyin Cahit Yalçın's, published in 1897. And Envisioning Progress in Islamic Civilization in Dream, published in 1913. Moreover, Sadık Usta's partial analysis of the utopian tradition in Turkey illustrates the rich literary, culture, and historical background of utopian literature. I quote, Turkish utopias assumed an historical responsibility and role in raising awareness among the citizens and acting in a revolutionary sense in times of intense social crises, unquote. The private theater company Tatbikat Sahnesi in Ankara, established by Erdal Beşikçioğlu, performed George Orwell's dystopian novella Animal Farm in 2012, in addition to their performance of Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 in 2020. Another theater company, Aysa Prodüksiyon Tiyatrosu, put Orwell's 1984 on the stage with the title 1984 Büyük Gözaltı in Istanbul and across the country in 2018 and 2019. This unique theatrical adaptation of Orwell's cult text, directed by the famous Turkish actor Rutkay Aziz, managed to attract a wider audience, arousing curiosity and interest in the country. Furthermore, numerous departments, such as English language and literature, philosophy, sociology, history, communication, architecture, urban planning, media, and political science in Turkish universities, have speculative fiction-related courses or issues in their undergraduate or graduate curricula, some of which are dystopian dissent and graphic narrative in contemporary literature at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, utopia and dystopia in English and Turkish at Cappadocia University in Cappadocia, spaces of utopia and dystopia and heterotopia at Shanky University in Ankara, utopia at Doğuş University in Istanbul, and utopian thought and utopian English literature at Hacettepe University in Ankara. These courses as well demonstrate the broad and interdisciplinary interests that exist at many Turkish universities. Another relevant conference entitled Living in the End Times, Utopian and Dystopian Representation of Pandemic in Fiction, Film and Culture, with the keynote speeches by Kim Stanley Robinson, Maggie G, and Larissa Lai, and over 200 speakers from 42 countries, was organized by the Department of English Language and Literature at Cappadocia University in Turkey this past January. So all these events, of course, like they show this broad interest. And Turkey's first and only science fiction library, Özgen Berkol Doğan Science Fiction Library, was founded and opened in Istanbul in 2012. This library is highly significant, not only because of its rich collection of utopian science fiction and other relevant materials, but also because it hosts enriching lectures and other events on a regular basis. FABİSAT, which stands for Fantasy and Science Fiction Arts Association in Turkey, also stands out as the only association that undertakes nationwide intellectual and academic initiatives to promote the power of imagination and speculative literature in Turkey. In addition, journals such as Atılgan Bilim Kurgu, Kogito, Doğu Batı, İtaki, Metis, Nostromo, Pasajlar, X Bilinmeyen, Yabani, and Yerli Bilim Kurgu Yükseliyor also publish relevant material. In conclusion,
thank you.
I hope I could provide information about access to SF in Turkey today, both for the audience and scholars within the very limited allocated time. Turkey has a rich literary tradition, but Turkish scholars need to work more to promote the field, both in Turkish and English. I look forward to the lively and interactive Q&A session. Thank you for listening to my talk.
Thank you so much, Emrah. That was wonderful. And really great timing. Just when I was about to come in, you wrapped up. So that was perfect. And I just wanted to mention, I did drop folks' Twitter handles in the chat. And I think we are gonna just put an updated one for our next presenter. So be on the lookout for that in just a moment. And our next presenter is Shanky Chandra, excuse me, who is a PhD scholar in New Delhi, India, who is studying Chinese science fiction. And his presentation for today is entitled Chinese Science Fiction, a Literary Genre, a Tool of Teaching Science, or a Secret Weapon of China's Soft Power. So whenever you're ready, Shanky, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jill, and thank you, City Tech Science Fiction Symposium, for providing me such a golden opportunity. So since the time is limited, so I'm very particular to my topic. So let me share my screen. Okay. Just All right. I hope, yes, I hope that you can see my screen. So as you know, my topic is actually limited to the role of a Chinese science fiction in the Chinese society and the political arena. So as you know, that the Liu Cixin took Chinese science fiction to a new height when he won the Hugo Prize for his famous novel Three-Body Problem in 2015. So last year, China released its first mega budget Chinese science fiction film, The Wandering Earth, which is based on the Liu Cixin's Three-Body trilogy. So it became the highest grossing science fiction film ever in China. Since 2019, when this movie adapted Liu Cixin's work, the impact it made has been nothing but spectacular. But before the Liu Cixin's works and everything, China has a very long history of science fiction as well. So uh, its history began from 1905 when the revolutionary intellectual like Lu Xun and Liang Qichao and Kang Youwei. So they introduced the Western science fiction into the Chinese society and the literary circles through the translation with the aim of to make the Chinese youngster, make them aware about science and technology and the progress in the world through the literary means. So that's how the science fiction history started in China in the early 20s. After that, in 1935, there was a Chinese science fiction novel as well by the Laoshe that is known as the Cat Country, which is based on some Martian society and everything. So that was the first tide of the Chinese science fiction in China. The second tide is actually started after the liberation of the China through the Communist Party. And the Communist Party, they promote the science fiction as a tool for propagating the socialist industrialization. So this time, the Chinese science fiction is quite limited to the children's story and promoting science and technology. And moreover, only the Soviet science fiction was allowed in China through the translation and everything. But after 1966, because in 1966, the Culture Revolution was started, and most of the science fiction writers, they were persecuted by the government because science fiction, as the Chinese government believe, it was known as the Western product. So they believe that it's a kind of bourgeoisie thing, which should not be permitted in our society. So from 1966 to 77, the science fiction in China was completely banned unofficially, and there was no single writing at that time. So in 1978, when China opened to the world, so they provide the free space to the free writers and everything, and due to the new industrial technology and everything they are infusing in their society so that they can compete with the world. So it provides a good space to the lots of science fiction writer. And the Death Coral Ray, that is the first Chinese science fiction movie which is directed in China at that time in 1980. But again in 1982, due to the anti-spiritual movement, which is started by the hardcore left-wing writer association in China, they criticized the science fiction again because they believe that it is anti-Marxist, or this is against of science and technology. They also put blame on science fiction to put vulgarity to the literature and everything. But that is the only one side of the story. The main reason for persecution is that the Chinese government, they were quite worried about that because science fiction is all about the speculative future. And if any science fiction writer, if he writes about China that in future there is no communist party, so that will be completely against of the what we say, the whole doctrine of the communist legitimacy in China. So they completely banned till 1990s after the Tiananmen Square incident. So after 1990s, three main science fiction writers were emerged like Han Song, Wang Jinghan, and Liu Cixin. But to be very honest, we never ever knew about more about science fiction until unless Liu Cixin, when he won the Hugo Award for his work, The Three-Body Problem. So that's how the new era of the Chinese science fiction began. in the world. So what is the role of the Chinese science fiction in the Chinese society? So in the beginning, as I mentioned, it is used as a tool to propagate, science and technology and some kind of what we say the modernity among the Chinese youngsters. In 1938, even the Mao Zedong in his famous Yan'an speech about art and literature, he also supports the role of science fiction in the society that we can use as a tool to propagate more modern knowledge and everything. So again, during the Cultural Revolution, it was banned from 66 to 1977, and again from 1982 till 1990s, I would say. So science fiction was completely banned. But what happened after that? Why the government they now promoting science fiction, especially after post 2000? So the Chinese government, they did lots of surveys about that, why they are not very good at creation and innovation. And what they realized, they sent their delegation to the Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Microsoft, Google, Cisco. What they realized, that most of the best scientists and the technocrats, male and female, they used to read a lot science fiction stories. So science fiction is actually what it did. It plants the seeds of creativity in the mind of people, especially in case of America. For that reason, China pay more attention on the science fiction and its story with the Chinese narrative. And even in nowadays, because the US-China trade relation, they are fighting like each other, and now the China, they don't have so many access to the American technology because of copyright and other issue. So they are also putting lots of effort to create a new generation of a technocrat with the help of science fiction teaching and everything. So as a new power of as a new weapon of the soft power, Chinese science fiction, why they need Chinese science fiction when they have all other platforms, the culture, the literature and everything? The first thing is that the Chinese government, they are not very good at the soft power. Like, for example, if you know that Confucius Institute and everything, they spend more than $6 billion, but still they don't get a very positive soft power. And most of the time they got much more negative promotion by their means of spreading soft power rather than the positive. So they were looking for something which is quite unique, which has no direct and indirect relation with the government, so that they can represent a very advanced and technologically advanced image of China in the world. So the science fiction, it becomes one of the best tool for them. And it's actually after the Liu Cixin, when he won the Hugo Award. So they found out that this is the best opportunity to spread our, what we say, our more advanced thinking, technology, our infrastructure through the Chinese science fiction medium. And that is the main thing, that the China is also trying to show the science and technological advancement through the Chinese science fiction, and trying to, to show the future of China as a superpower, as a hub of innovation, not as a manufacturing hub and something. So what's wrong? What's wrong with this? Like, if the Chinese government, they are using science fiction as a tool, of course it provides money and everything, and it's good for the writers as well. There's no harm for that. Like, even in America, like, we can see that most of the Hollywood movies, the science fiction movies, like when I saw the Independence Day, I realized that, oh my goodness, America is so advanced that they have solution for everything. They can fight with aliens. And what kind of message I received, that don't mess with America. Okay, it's very powerful. What's wrong with that? The problem is not the science fiction. The problem is the Chinese authority. Like, in 2020, they issue a document for the science fiction genre, that how they tailor and streamline the science fiction creation according to the party line, according to the Marxist and the communist line. That is the first major problem. The second problem is they have to contribute in their work the Xi Jinping thoughts, the Communist Party thoughts, and according to the Chinese culture and customs. They have to be very careful about their narrative and everything. And the increasing close ties between the science fiction writer and the state agency, like, created a condition in which they have to work and promote the elements of the regime, of the official narrative of the Chinese government. So this means what? This means that the government agency can play an important role in choosing narrative which fits to the Chinese agenda. It will kill the creation. It will kill the the innovative capability of the Chinese science fiction as well. So my conclusion is that that according to the Professor David Irvang from the Harvard as well, that he's one of the best, commentator on the Chinese literature and everything. Chinese science fiction is not one of the best science fiction which China can provide to the world, but it is one of the best literature they can provide right now in the world. And if they can use like a what we say as a tool of science fiction, but if they put more interfere, if the Chinese science fiction is suffering from the more political interference, it will definitely kill its authenticity and the innovative nature and creativity. So in my suggestion, in my humble opinion, it is better to leave science fiction as it is. Otherwise, in future, maybe or maybe not, the reader will not read the Chinese science fiction, not because it is a Chinese science fiction, but it is politically contaminated. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shanky. Really fascinating. And thank you also for keeping to time. You all are making my task here so easy. When you're ready to stop sharing your screen, that would be fantastic. And we'll get ready for our final presentation. Last but not least, we have Gillian Polack, who is an Australian speculative fiction writer. And before we start with her presentation, I just wanted to note that she's also generously recorded a more expanded version of this presentation, and that is linked from this program if you'd like to watch that at a future time. Speaking of future times, it sounds like she's also joining us from her Friday, so our imagined future. One final thing before I turn it over, it is an Access and SF theme. I would be remiss to not point out that the City Tech Science Fiction Collection and the Symposium are all hosted on the City Tech Open Lab, which is our college's homegrown open access, open source platform for teaching, learning, and collaborating. There's wonderful examples of OERs and open pedagogy there. I'll throw the link in the chat, but just do check it out at some point. There's a really robust culture of openness and access here at the college, and we're really proud of that. Thank you for letting me share that with you. And now we'll hear from Gillian, whose presentation today is The Problem of Susan, Australia, or the Tyranny of Distance. So whenever you're ready, Gillian.
I need to unmute myself. First, I'd like to say that it's a very wet Friday morning here. It's about 1:45 a.m. The other paper is related rather than being an extended version. And it's because in the pre-paper, I took the sexy approach to the topic. I discussed which Australian speculative fiction writers are allowed into New Narnia and which of us remain Susan. New Narnia is my rather obvious metaphor for US speculative fiction mainstream publishing. Today, I want to examine more mundane factors in relation to the tyranny of distance. The term, the tyranny of distance, is to many Australians the equivalent cultural trope to manifest destiny for Americans. It was encapsulated by Geoffrey Blaney in a book of that same name in 1967. It covers more than physical distance. It includes impossible obstacles and daft decisions and a tendency to privilege other cultures, all triggered by local geography. In its way, it encapsulates Australians' historical self-view to the end of the 20th century. Geoffrey Blaney was an historian, so that makes sense. I need to add that I also am an historian when I'm not being a science fiction writer. In 10 minutes, I can't give you more than a suggestion of what the tyranny of distance means to Australian writers, and I'll keep it very practical. The poetic viewer is in the other paper. Let me begin with the problem of income. Income is such a fun thing. The Australian Society of Authors, the ASA, surveys writers annually, a professional organisation undertaking an income survey mostly of fiction writers. 53.6% of full-time writers recently surveyed receive less than $15,000 a year. Australia's economy is quite different to that of the US. The poverty line in Australia is currently just under $24,000 a year. That's $9,000 more than writers receive for full-time work. The minimum wage is just over $40,000. 23.7% of the writers earn above the minimum wage for full-time professional writing. Most of these 23.7% rely on the international market and the US market is critical. It's the most important market for Australian writers. The problem of Susan is one of barriers. Doors into New Narnia can be difficult. Access to the US market as an Australian creates a Jill Pole in my Narnia metaphor. That was purely so I could make a bad pun because I am Gillian Polack and I'm not a Jill Pole. Garth Nix is a Jill Pole, for example. He's well known in the US. The kings and queens of Narnia, of whom Jack Dan is one, have local access to US markets. Most Australian writers are Susans. We have occasional access, followed by long-term, she doesn't quite belong. Compared with other countries in our region, Australia is hugely advantaged. Compared with China and Turkey, Australia is hugely advantaged. This sense of Australian privilege conflicts with the near impossibility for most Australian writers to earn even minimum wage from full-time work. Furthermore, access to US publishing can make or break an Australian writer's career. However, access to the US to achieve publishing and promotion presents material, physical, and cultural costs. Let me start with the cultural, because that's my favorite area. It's also more fun. We're culturally very different countries. Our writing industries are exceptionally so. This affects agents, promotional opportunities, and even what shops stock which books. While Australian SF bookshops stock mainly US SF writers, not a single US SF bookshop stocks mainly Australian SF writers. This sales bias leads to sales of books for many Australian SF writers in the hundreds of copies, not even in the thousands. Advances reflect this and are increasingly rare, and the unpaid work writers do for promotion and for publicity is vast, and it's still growing. Some Australian writers handle the complex reality of the US publishing industry by becoming culturally literate in the ways of the US. Their writing reflects US genre models rather than Australian. Their language becomes less Australian. Some writers visit the US every year. They establish, they maintain writing-related social groups. They attend conferences like World Fantasy, especially World Fantasy. An important part of the personal lives of some writers, in fact, becomes invested in the US, and slowly and gently, this develops into writing careers. What's the cost? First, we lose the own voices thing. I'll answer questions on this one if anybody's interested, rather than talking about it now because it's complicated. Secondly, the material and physical costs, which is a bit easier. The choice of regular visits to the US is an exclusive one. Meeting publishers, editors, journalists in a convivial setting is the distant stuff of dreams for many professional Australian writers. Australia is a long way from anywhere else. Even New Zealand and Singapore aren't close, and they're our neighbours. Someone like me with invisible disabilities and a writer's small income has to think twice or three times before attending a face-to-face convention outside even our own city. My next door city neighbour is 3.5 hours away by car, and it's Sydney, and I'm in the national capital. Leaving Australia itself costs in the thousands of dollars. Additionally, Australia has no Science Fiction Writers of America equivalent. In fact, some Australian writers join SFWA rather than the ASA. There are social and professional costs when one chooses between the ASA and SFWA. For those who ask why not both, there is a reason I led with writer's income. Coming from minority backgrounds or having disabilities or being rainbow also bring costs. Often the costs are similar to those handled by US writers with equivalent backgrounds, but our biases are different, so who carries them is not always evident. For example, who's white, who's not quite white, and who's not white at all can be quite different in our two countries. Fandom in Australia is also not identical to fandom in the US. In some ways, Australia is very egalitarian. This is not always the benefit of writers. Writers pay to attend local conventions. and even the outdoor cost is in the hundreds of dollars. Yet we don't have green rooms or separate spaces for industry professionals to meet. While speculative fiction writers are very much a part of fandom here, with all the good that entails, this openness makes it harder for writers to develop supportive professional circles. And those circles that develop can be racist in an Australian way, again, due to the lack of that green room to bring people together with like interests but different backgrounds. You can look around certain groups of writers here and see the many cultural values of white. As an off-white Australian, I've experienced the need to prove myself from scratch all the time, because being not white here carries the burden of constant testing to ensure our inclusion is earned. The fact that numbers of Australian writers are internationally notable and make a living from their work says a great deal about how culturally important books are in Australia. The average number of books held within any Australian household is 12, which is a lot more than almost every other country in the world. But it's also a testament to the success of individuals against significant odds. The tyranny of distance is partly about conquering. Why aren't the problems reversed for US writers? For one thing, US speculative fiction is a much bigger bubble. For another, there's an odd little cultural difference that means that many Australian writers will say yes to things that hurt. My least comfortable academic paper this year was at 4:30 a.m. My US friends asked, why did you accept it? My Australian friend said, it was in the US, wasn't it? We're a country of anecdotes, but we're a country of acceptance that we won't ever have easy access to US markets, and it's essential to jump extra hoops to ensure basics. The last 2 years have changed things, but it's too early to say how much has been changed. A lot depends on whether the publishing industry incorporates hybrid events or learns to integrate a larger range of own voices. Ask me about entry into New Narnia again in 3 years.
Thank you so much, Gillian. That was amazing. And thanks to everybody who's participating in the chat with this lively discussion. This is all really wonderful, through really fascinating and important perspectives that we don't always get a chance to talk about here in the US. So I just wanted to open it up to questions and comments and discussion from the audience. We have about 10 minutes, and a friendly reminder that folks can use the Q&A feature in the Zoom webinar to ask their question. Oh, my timer. So Gillian came out ahead. Yeah, she's awesome. So I'll just give that a moment to see if folks want to get their questions in. And I also, while we're waiting, I know Jason might have one, but also just a reminder that the panelists should feel free to ask questions of one another as well, because I know in the chat you've all been really hearing resonances and interest with each other's work. So, but Jason, did you want to jump in?
I just had one question I wanted to ask Shanky, please. I'm wondering if there are examples from your research where a Chinese writer is using science fiction as a way to make a veiled criticism of the Chinese authorities or these rules that are being imposed on science fiction more generally? Or is that something you don't see, or it may be even unsafe for a science fiction writer in China to do?
Thank you, sir. So one of the big example is actually the writings of a famous science fiction writer, Han Sung. So most of his works is actually pretty dark and highly critical about the authoritarianism and the totalitarianism. So the irony is that the Han Sung, he won his what we say a science fiction award from Taiwan in 1982. But because his work considered is very dark and very anti-regime, it was not until 1991 that his works were actually permitted in China to publish for that. So that is the first thing. And if you look at the Liu Cixin works, right, it is completely different what it's published in America and in China. Because in China, there is no mention of culture revolution and everything, because Liu Cixin, he himself was a red card, and he suffered a lot during the culture revolution and the political persecution. So he actually tried to criticize the regime, but not in the Chinese version, but in the English version, which is translated by the Kun Liu. And I will share more about that. There are lots of Chinese writers who also wrote most of the things like epidemic and the current scenario and the biological weapons and something, which is now completely gone from what we say, most of the Chinese science fiction platform.
Well, thank you. Can I ask maybe another question? Unless someone, I'm looking in the list of attendees. If
I had a question, Jason.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to comment on something that was mentioned in the chat, that Jim Henderson said it was nice to hear about writing as commerce, and that struck me too. During Gillian's presentation, I think a lot of as a creative person, my work is not creative, but my hobbies are, and I think that there is a stigma almost in wanting to be compensated for creative works, right? So I always appreciate when a discussion around the finances, because that time is valuable and it should be considered worthy of pay or and beyond exposure, right? Like other industries. So, it was great to hear that perspective, Gillian. And there are more comments being made about that. I agree. If you see Reese, if I'm saying that properly, there really seems to be, around a stigma around compensation for creative works, and it's something that should be discussed more openly, I think.
It's something that a lot of Australian writers are trying to address because most of the successful Australian writers do that with the help of a day job. So you're doing full-time work on top of full-time work. I mean, my day job is I'm doing a PhD, and it's my third PhD. This wouldn't work in the US. Australian PhDs have much nicer scholarships. And so my novels are the evening thing and my PhD is my day job.
It's so fascinating. And I just wanted to say this is all, of course, complicated by the notion of open access, which is not necessarily what we were talking right there. But when you think about works, especially creative works, being made freely available, and that was actually something that we talked about at last year's symposium too. So I just wanted to throw that out as well. We think about creativity or don't as commerce, and then what does it mean when it's sort of put into an open space, and we want to value that sharing, but what happens to the material reality of those who are also doing the work? So
the New Zealand government actually tried their hand at that recently. They put a couple of 100,000, I don't remember the number at all, of non-New Zealand books up for archive.org, and a lot of them were still in copyright. And the science fiction world, I was part of a bit of a furor that we created in the New Zealand government. The New Zealand National Library is reconsidering the donation of in-copyright books for free access online.
yeah,
Yes, as a librarian, that's particularly a hot button topic, sort of the tension between wanting to make things freely available for students, and understanding that there are financial constraints to being a student in the US, as you very aptly pointed out, but confronting that with compensation for writers, and how open access can limit your options, with that. So it's sort of a fine line to walk as the person responsible for collections in particular, as a librarian in general, but specifically tasked with adding to the collection. How do you satisfy both parties, which have equal worth and importance? So
you could stay within the law. That's where the New Zealand went wrong. They were not observing copyright.
yes, for sure.
it's such a fascinating discussion. Emrah, I saw you had your hand up before. I wanted to give you an opportunity to weigh in if you wanted.
Thanks so much. And I just had a quick question maybe to Gillian, about Australia. I guess all the questions go to her. So another question. Yes. So I was wondering if there's also kind of increase in the number of adaptation to the screen, adaptation of SF works in Australian culture to, because with the International Film Festival to be held this weekend in Istanbul, I think the increase has been amazing, and especially they've been collaborating with the ministry. And because it is by the director rather than just let's say an English department or something, I think they have brought so many different sectors together, and I think that kind of contributes to to the promotion of the genre, and also people interested in the field. Is there such a kind of potential interest in Australia as well?
Australia is science fiction besotted. We really are. So Netflix is our favorite subscription service, and I have been watching Turkish fantasy on Netflix because there's some really good stuff. It's not automatic for us, but think of our region where we reached anime before the US. So watching things with subtitles is not as difficult for a lot of Australians as it is for some other English-speaking countries. It's not as good as, we're still monolingually English publicly. We're still really restricted and really limited, but we will watch anything if it's science fiction or fantasy. That's why it's hard to explain. It's hard to explain. Australia doesn't like education, doesn't like educated people much. It's got a tall poppy syndrome. But if you're a science fiction writer, they'll talk to you anyway, because you're writing the right things. So it's not a bad place to be a science fiction writer if you can make a living, and that's the tricky bit.
Shanky, I see you have your hand up, and then we do have one question in the Q&A that maybe we'll have time for quickly.
Okay, I have a very small question to Gillian. So Gillian, my question is that is there any special science fiction research center in Australia? If
yes.
it is,
yes, so Perth has a library, which is especially science fiction, but Melbourne and Brisbane have a bunch of academics. So we've got a lot of, that's why I'm doing a third PhD. It's a luxury I can do. I can, this is in fantasy as literature, in literary studies approach to fantasy. It's hard to explain. It's not one big research center. We have very little government interest in giving money to the arts, and especially to critical arts like science fiction. We have a right-wing, really nasty government right now, like a couple of other countries, but we've got a strong interest in it. So there are academics at a bunch. So Monash is one, yes. Emrah, thank you. Deakin is also. Melbourne University has 3 or 4 academics who are, we have a big crossover between medieval studies and speculative fiction. There are maybe 3 dozen academics in the country that do both. And so they will teach both, and that means there's a big dynamism happening. And yes, my first doctorate was in medieval studies. That's why I know the numbers. So yes and no, not like Liverpool, not like the US, not like Toronto with the big collection, but throughout the country, and we talk a lot across cities. So yes, we have that social group and the interest and the research, but it's a bit spread out.
Thanks so much for this really lively discussion. I did want to just note we're just about out of time. There is a question in the Q&A from Kadir, and we're going to throw that over to the chat because it's sort of a broader question and let folks answer it there as we continue. But before we leave, I actually just wanted to bring Emrah into the conversation and just ask, you mentioned in your presentation, talking about barriers to access, especially from the Turkish SF standpoint in terms of the linguistic, right, language barriers. And we've been talking about sort of the commercial and market constraints, the sort of political constraints in the Chinese. So could you say a little bit more about how you're navigating that, or how you're seeing, the landscape of Turkish SF changing in terms of providing access within the country itself to non-Turkish SF?
You mean like in terms of access to like Turkish science fiction for international like scholars, or?
I guess I'm thinking of it broadly. There was so much in your presentation that sparked in my mind. I guess either way, I mean, what are you sort of seeing? You have your pulse on what's happening. What are you seeing as how that's working?
I think now, maybe as in the case of Australia now, especially like through collaborations with like Netflix or, like I think with different like these platforms, like they are, because I think this festival, I'm hoping like to spark like even broader interest because, now they have worked so much like they've been on national TV, like in national radios and also in newspapers. So I think so many people, maybe many people hear the word dystopia for the first time in their lives. So like, such terminology. And then I gave a talk in Turkish to kind of also introduce the terminology in Turkish because I think as like scholars who have access to this, contemporary scholarship, we should work also towards contributing to our own culture. So I've been also trying to kind of publish in Turkish to kind of introduce, terminology or even translate, even though I'm not a translator, because I've been working on the field also with other colleagues across the country, because now this book, for example, we asked really like 16 academics just, we chose them on the basis of their like background, like relevant background. So, and I think especially through this like Zoomification, like or Zoom like events, we have seen also a huge like increase in the number of workshops just for the general public. I've had friends like and colleagues who are organizing workshops like to kind of introduce now posthumanism, transhumanism, or like different aspects of science fiction, and people are really interested. Or maybe I think some colleagues are now against this commodification of the field, especially as in the case of dystopia, but it also sells. I think wherever I see in Turkey now, I see an exhibition, they put dystopia or like utopia, then people come. And then I think if it works like toward arousing this, I think interest, I think that's fair for the moment, because then but I think still people should read more, or like academics should like do more work to kind of really tell what the field is about, rather than when you just put a flying object, it's not science fiction, or just you put something like unusual, it is not science fiction or dystopia. So in this festival, like or like other occasions, now I think people's interest like has aroused, and I've seen also a huge increase in the number of theses like written on the field, from not only from like English language and literature departments, but also from sociology, politics, and also because of the current, I think, political aura in the country, there is like an interest, but of course, also coming from history, Turkish, different departments. Yeah, I don't know. It's a broad question. I hope I could answer like your question, Jill.
Oh, you're right. I threw a super big question and you gave a really great answer. And there's so much more to discuss, but unfortunately we are actually over time. So we're going to wrap it up here. I just want to thank again our presenters, Emrah, Shanky, and Gillian. This was wonderful. And please do continue the conversation in the chat and on social media. I'm going to turn it back over to Jason so we can hopefully get back on schedule for our next presentation. So thank you all.